In this week's readings, we've come to the portion of the novel Frankenstein where we hear the creature's tale in his own words. He's persuaded Victor to sit down and listen to what he has to say after finding him in the Alps, which we read about last week. And in much the same way that Victor told Walton at the beginning of the book that there was a purpose behind his telling his story, so that it serves as a warning to Walton, the creature also says that there's a purpose to the tale that he's going to be telling. He wants something from Victor, and this is his appeal for the thing that he's going to ask. We'll talk about that appeal in more detail at the end of this lecture. In the meanwhile, the creature takes us right back to the night that he was created in Victor's lab, and it's a little strange reading about things from his perspective. You can tell that Mary Shelley is trying to capture the thought process of someone who finds themselves in this hypothetical situation where they're a fully grown adult but with no knowledge or comprehension of the world around them. The only things he can grasp at first are sensations. He feels hunger and cold. Looking up at the moon gives him a sensation of pleasure. He doesn't have any comprehension of the world around him outside of that. It's all a blur. He hears birds in the woods where he's hiding and tries to imitate their sounds, but he can't. And he's longing for the ability to articulate what he's feeling, for an outlet to express himself, but he doesn't have one, much like an infant. He actually resembles the cases of feral children or wild men who would crop up in the news in London from time to time and still crop up even today. These would be children who, for various reasons, grew up in the wild, isolated from all human care and contact from a very young age. They would have no experience or understanding of human behavior or of human language. Now, this has always been something of a popular trope in art and literature as well. We could think of Romulus and Remus being raised by a she-wolf in Roman mythology, or of Mowgli in Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book, which was written in the late 19th century, or even of Tarzan of the Apes by Edgar Rice Burroughs a couple of decades later. Mary Shelley may have heard of one such case, Peter the Wild Child. You can look up his information on Wikipedia. He had been discovered in the woods of Germany by King George I's hunting party the century before. And the boy was taken back to London and raised by the royal family, and he actually lived to an old age, but he never learned how to speak or write. Contemporary writers such as Jonathan Swift and Daniel Defoe were interested in this case, and they wrote about it, as well as many others, because it presents them with the question of whether or not language was an innate instinct that we all possess, or if it's something that we learn from living in a community with others. It's an interesting question that people are still pondering about and researching today. So we see Mary Shelley's creature exhibiting that language instinct. He wants to express himself even though there's no one around, but he doesn't know how. At this point, he's living a subhuman existence, and his only goal is to satisfy the sort of practical needs for survival. But then, he stumbles across a fire left by other travelers in the woods, and we see him progressing from this subhuman, sensation-driven stage up to the stage of thought. He says that he sees the fire and reflects on the source of it in order to learn how to keep it going so it doesn't go out. And I think this is interesting because the link between fire and intelligence, or even fire and civilization, goes all the way back to the Greek myth of Prometheus. And this is a link that Mary Shelley would have been familiar with because she did, after all, give her novel the subtitle, The Modern Prometheus, which we've talked about before. We see the Prometheus myth portrayed wonderfully in the playwright Aeschylus's tragedy Prometheus Bound. There, the Titan is being punished by Zeus and the Olympians for bestowing a gift upon the hapless Neanderthal-like human race. And the play is a bit ambivalent about what that gift is. Sometimes the characters say that it was the gift of fire. Other times they say that it was the gift of foreknowledge. The two are used almost interchangeably or synonymously throughout the play. And I think that the idea there is that all culture begins with fire, with fulfilling that basic material need of fending off the elements and cooking food, which acts as sustenance. So watching the campfire and reflecting about how to sustain it sort of ushers in a new stage in the development of the creature's mind. And as his mind grows, his needs grow too. He's no longer satisfied with just living in the woods and foraging for nuts and berries. He wants shelter now, and more importantly, companionship. After a couple of chance encounters with random people on the street, which end disastrously, he eventually takes refuge in a sort of lean-to shed that's connected to a small cottage in the woods where a family of French immigrants live. There's a blind old father, a melancholy son, and a sad daughter, and they seem to be living in poverty. But the creature doesn't understand the concept of poverty at first. To his eyes, they have a shelter and they have each other's companionship, so what more could they want? He describes his feelings upon watching them as a mixture of pain and pleasure, and I think this is something that anyone who has ever felt left out of anything or felt like an outcast can relate to. Watching that close-knit family and the love they have for each other simultaneously warms his heart and also makes him feel his own lack of such a family more keenly. Again, remember that one of the themes that runs throughout this book is that of familial affection. Being surrounded by a loving family is pictured as one of the chief goods of life, and being isolated, we've seen, can lead someone into all sorts of trouble. So we've seen that the creature grows from having animal needs to now having human, or one might even say cultivated needs. It actually mirrors a concept in psychology known as Maslow's hierarchy of needs, with those such as food, water, and the rest at the bottom, and those of self-fulfillment and creativity at the top. It looks like a pyramid if you've ever seen an illustration of it. And we can see his longing for these higher needs beginning when he starts asking himself the big questions, right? He asks, who am I? Why am I here? Where did I come from? These are all questions that we ask as well, so we can see that he's not just sort of this animal creature that's running from his own shadow and trying to mimic bird sounds anymore. And this is also reflected by the fact that the creature starts to learn to speak and write during his time as an observer of this family of cottagers. He stumbles across some books in the woods one day, one of which is John Milton's Paradise Lost. He's fascinated about the relationship between God and Adam in that epic poem, but he feels that he can relate more to Satan as someone who's been cast out and left to fend for themselves and who's caught up in the agonies of envy. He says, after he reads that book, that Paradise Lost moves him with every feeling of wonder and awe that the picture of an omnipotent God warring with his creatures was capable of exciting. I often referred the several situations as their similarity struck me to my own. Like Adam, I was created apparently united by no link to any other being in existence. But his state was far different from mine in every other respect. He had come forth from the hands of God, a perfect creature, happy and prosperous, guarded by the especial care of his Creator. He was allowed to converse with and acquire knowledge from beings of a superior nature, but I was wretched, helpless, and alone. Many times I considered Satan as the fitter emblem of my condition, for often, like him, when I viewed the bliss of my protectors, the bitter gall of envy rose within me. And then a little bit later, he says, I sickened as I read. Hateful day when I received life, I exclaimed in agony. Cursed Creator, why did you form a monster so hideous that even you turned from me in disgust? Talking about Victor. God in pity made man beautiful and alluring after his own image, but my form is a filthy type of yours, more horrid from its very resemblance. Satan had his companions, fellow devils, to admire and encourage him, but I am solitary and detested. So he envies Adam that his Creator at least cared enough about him to converse with him and tell him what was going on, and he even envies Satan for his companionship of the fallen angels in hell. He has no one, but he's still feeling stirred to acts of virtue by the example that's set by the family of cottagers. We learn about this family's history in more detail And it paints a grim picture of the ingratitude of mankind and the cruelty of the justice system of the various justice systems of the world, in much the same way that Justine's trial did a few chapters back. The family's name is de Lacy, and they're in such dire straits because the son, Felix, went out of his way to rescue a Muslim merchant who was living in the city of Paris at the same time as they were and who had been sentenced to death by the government. We're not told why exactly the merchant was being put on trial, only that it was unjust. And Felix makes a vow to break him out of jail for no other reason than that his sensibility was offended by the blatantly corrupt judgment of the court. Later, he meets the merchant's daughter, Safi, and falls in love with her. But from the beginning, his actions and his vows are stemming from his own nobility of character and not out of any self-interest. Now, the creature admires Felix for this and wants to be virtuous and noble as well in emulation of him. But we also see the ingratitude of human nature on display too. The merchant has promised that Felix can marry his daughter, even encouraging the love affair along to spur him on to his rescue all the more. But once he's free and they're on the run, he betrays Felix. He doesn't want his daughter marrying a Christian. And he gives him the slip when Felix has to go back to Paris for his father and his sister, who've both been cast into prison as a result of his actions. This explains why Felix has been so melancholy and why the family is dejected. Felix performed this heroic act of selflessness which cost his family everything they had and was met with nothing but betrayals for his efforts. It paints a really grim picture. But soon the merchant's daughter gives her father the slip in return and is reunited with Felix at the cottage, even though she can't speak their language. And now the de Lacy family begins giving her lessons in French, which works out well for the creature because he can listen in and learn at the same time through a hole in the wall. So once the creature has obtained mastery of the language, and an almost a whole summer season passes away in the meantime, he decides that he can't be an observer anymore. He wants to be a part of this loving, noble family that he's come to love. He's realized at this point that he's monstrous, and knows that his appearance will prejudice people against him, so he decides to make his appeal to the blind old father while the children are away. He's terrified of what will happen if they reject him, but he has hope because he's learned that these are good people and that, if anyone, they should be able to sympathize with his problems. Again, looking for sympathy, looking for a companion who can accept him for what he is. These are things that tie back to Robert Walton's needs and his loneliness at the beginning of the novel. It's a universal need that has to be met in order to be fully human, according to Shelley, I think. And according to the Bible as well, all the way back in the book of Genesis, one of God's first observations about his new creature, Adam, is that it's not good for man to be alone. Later on, when the creature is wrapping up his story, he makes this comment: "If I have no ties and no affections, hatred and vice must be my portion. The love of another will destroy the cause of my crimes, and I shall become a thing of whose existence everyone will be ignorant. My vices are the children of a forced solitude that I abhor, and my virtues will necessarily arise when I live in communion with an equal. I shall feel the affections of a sensitive being and become linked to the chain of existence and events from which I am now excluded." So he's describing this chain of existence of which everything in the world is a part because everything is somehow connected to something else. He alone is the outcast because he was created in an unnatural way. There's no link between him and a mother or a family or even a species of being. The chain of being, or the chain of existence, is an idea originating from medieval Christianity, with God at the top, then angels and men, then animals, and finally plants and minerals on the bottom. The idea was later co-opted by evolutionary thinkers in the 18th and 19th centuries in an idea called orthogenesis. This was the thought that all things evolve from lower forms of life to higher forms towards an increased biological complexity and motivated by some end goal. This was touted by French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who was an early evolutionist and whose ideas carried some weight until they fell out of favor when another evolutionist, Charles Darwin, took center stage. All this is to say that the first readers of Frankenstein may have picked up on the creature's reference to a chain of being, whether they were religious or whether they were part of the increasing crowd of agnostics and atheists that were coming to prominence in the 19th century. So the creature approaches Old Man de Lacy and manages to have a pleasant conversation with him until Felix and the two women come home early and see this hulking monster alone in the cottage with their father. And the results are predictable. Felix attacks the creature until he flees, and then the family abandons the cottage entirely. That's the last we ever see of them. The creature's hopes have been crushed by all of this, and we see him undergo another progression, this time not from an animal-like nature to a cultivated man, but from a cultivated man to a monster. We've seen the first seeds of this transformation being sown already when he described that bitter gall of envy that he felt toward the family. It's a dangerous emotion to have, envy, because it causes you to question the justice of the world that you live in. Why should this one person have a loving family when I don't get to have one? This happens with more superficial things as well, of course. It's why covetousness is condemned in the Ten Commandments. Left unchecked, even coveting really the silliest things can consume a person. In the Old Testament, we see the wicked King Ahab coveting the vineyard of one of his subjects. And when he tries to buy it from him, the man refuses because it's part of his ancestral lands, and Ahab ends up killing him for it, for a vineyard. Well, the creature already envies the love and support that he's been witness to, and now that it's been denied to him, that envy turns into bitterness and resentment. He expresses these feelings in acts of violence. He says, "All save I were at rest or in enjoyment. I, like the arch-fiend, bore a hell within me, and finding myself unsympathized with, wished to tear up the trees, spread havoc and destruction around me, and then to have sat down and enjoyed the ruin. From that moment I declared everlasting war against the species, and more than all against him who had formed me and sent me forth to this insupportable misery." In other words, if he can't have these things that are being denied to him, nobody else should be able to. And he's going to see to it that they can't. He'll sit down amongst the ruins and enjoy them. His hatred of rejection consumes him, and he's tearing up the trees and going on a path of senseless destruction. And his first act, after learning that the de Lacy family is gone, is to burn the cottage that they lived in to the ground. Again, just to destroy what he can't possess for his own. He even tears up the garden in the yard, just really almost petty acts of violence. And he admits that this isn't in his nature. He has feelings of sensibility, but he can't express them without someone to sympathize with him. And as he makes his way toward Geneva, because he's learned that that's where Victor and his family live, he makes one last effort. He thinks, well, surely a child, right, wouldn't be terrified of my deformity. Maybe I can make friends with a child, and it will grow up accustomed to me, and I'll finally have a friend. But when he finds a child, a young boy, and makes this last attempt, the boy kicks and screams and tries to fight him off. And he says that his father, Mr. Frankenstein, will see to it that he's punished. You might imagine that this was exactly the wrong thing to say. This tells the creature that it's Victor's younger brother, William. The creature is filled with rage, and even more so with despair. He despairs of anyone ever sympathizing with or loving him. And in that moment, he kills William, and he says this: "I gazed on my victim, and my heart swelled with exultation and hellish triumph. Clapping my hands, I exclaimed, I too can create desolation. My enemy is not impregnable. This death will carry despair to him, and 1,000 other miseries shall torment and destroy him." So the transformation from envy to hatred is complete now. He's suffering, and he's going to make the world, and especially Victor, suffer too. And so that's the end of the creature's tale, and he wraps things up by making his request, or rather demand, to Frankenstein. He wants him to make another creature, like himself, but female. Now, it's understandable that this is the last thing that Victor wants to do. He suffered horribly since bringing life to the first monster he created, and now he's being told that he has to make another. The creature says that he'll take his new bride and he'll go away. They'll flee to the jungles of South America, away from all civilization, and Victor will never hear from them again. He pinky promises. If Victor refuses, he promises to get his revenge on not just Victor and his family, but on the rest of mankind as well. Victor eventually agrees to create the bride. Whether it was the right thing to do, we'll talk about in future lectures. But he's driven not only by considerations for the safety of his family, but out of a sense of fairness and justice that he feels is due to the creature after hearing his tale. He does, finally, start to feel responsible for his reckless actions and think about what he can do to atone for them. He's not running away from his problems anymore. Really, he can't. The creature has just proven that through its supernatural strength it can track him down just about anywhere he goes on the globe. He can't escape. We'll see how all this plays out next week as the novel returns to Victor's narration. So for the next time, read chapters 1 through 5 of Volume 3, and we'll take it up from there. Thanks.